Unprecedented chaos in Moscow has yet to ease Ukraine's bitter fight in the trenches. Close combat around Bakhmut, 2 weeks into the continued grind of the counter-offensive open operations, filmed over the weekend, just as Wagner troops roll towards Moscow. Here, the red, white and blue are Russians in disarray and surrendering. The hope is more will follow as word spreads of the failed rebellion and morale and discipline falter. It was near here Ukraine proclaimed Monday progress on the front lines, with room for hope elsewhere. To the south, on another Donetsk front near the heavily contested Marinka, it appears some Kremlin-loyal Chechen fighters were pulled to Moscow for its defence at the weekend. Here, they are strutting along an apparent highway near the capital. Bakhmut and Marinka, opportunities for Ukraine in the east, but also further west near Kherson, the Antonivsky Bridge, the scene of intense clashes. Captured by this Russian drone as Ukrainian forces claimed to cross over to the Russian-controlled eastern bank, opening another front perhaps. It is too early to tell whether or if Russia is crumbling, and Ukraine's progress has been incremental still. This, the familiar scene when their fighters declared they'd captured another small village in the south, Rivnopil, on Monday. None of this yet, the strategic sea change and Russian collapse, the weekend's madness that Zelensky, visiting troops in the east Monday as well, will hope follows. He faces anxious choices, even with all the Kremlin's intimate ugliness so exposed. Move now, or wait for more in Moscow to unravel. He must be sure to make no mistakes of his own, or interrupt the torrent of them in Moscow.
Why do you think Putin didn't arrest Prigozhin when he was in Russia, marching toward Moscow, given Prigozhin will now, of course, be a constant reminder of Putin's failings whilst ever he's out there putting out these videos?
Well, I think what we saw in Rostov, first of all, showed that he has quite a base of his own and that a lot of people view him and Wagner as kind of folk heroes because of what they've done on the battlefield in Ukraine. And second, I think in some ways, as perverse as it seems, Putin was showing this kind of Tsar-like magnanimity. And I think that's why you didn't see him get engaged until today. Until yesterday. Why you saw him kind of trying not to get his hands dirty and acting at a remove, letting other people handle this. It's a way of showing that he's above this, he's bigger than this. And if this man wants to go live in exile, he'll grant him that kind of benevolent request. I think it's a bit of theater as well.
What do you think the Russian people make of all this? And of course, how much should we read into the cheering and supportive crowd surrounding Prigozhin at the start of his march to Moscow? I mean, is that representative of how many Russians feel about him particularly?
Well, the cheering came at the end of his march when he was pulling out of Rostov. It's hard to tell what Russian people think. I think people in part could have been cheering him again because this idea that, you know, they're fighting for the motherland. They could be cheering for him because he is an alternative to Putin and he's bringing any kind of change, not really thinking ahead to what kind of change that might be if somebody like Prigozhin, who's a hardline nationalist and kind of fascist, were to be in charge. And it also depends on where in the country you're talking about. So maybe in the south, closer to the war, people feel more, more closer to him. In places like the capital, people were clearly scared of him. People in the capital a lot of them have their lives tied up with Putin and the regime he created. It's why you didn't see any of them join, at least publicly, Prigozhin's coup. They all sat around and waited to see who would ultimately win. And I think there was a real sense of relief when Prigozhin blinked and turned around because they understand who Prigozhin is and that, change might be good, but maybe not that kind of change. And they better kind of sit tight and ride this out.
Julia Yavi, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
This might just be the biggest test yet of their, quote, no-limits partnership. President Xi Jinping of China has described Russian President Vladimir Putin as his best and most intimate friend. The two leaders have pledged to create a new world order together. Not to mention they share a common ideological adversary, the U.S. But some analysts see the events over this weekend in Russia as weakening Putin's power, leaving Russia's neighbors to the south and biggest ally, China, navigating uncertain waters. In a previously unannounced visit, Russia's deputy foreign minister immediately traveled to Beijing to meet with Chinese officials over the weekend, including with Foreign Minister Qin Gang. It's seen by some as this scramble to reassure China that Russia is stable and that things there are under control. For its part, Chinese state media echoing that narrative. Even as CNN and most Western media aired Prigozhin's convoy advancing in Russia, Chinese state TV showed a peaceful, calm atmosphere around the Kremlin. Interestingly, though, Chinese social media, which is tightly controlled, showed some users expressing concern over what might happen in Russia and how that could potentially impact China. On Sunday, Chinese officials finally addressed the situation in Russia, calling it Russia's internal affairs and pledging its support for Russia in protecting national stability. China's diplomatic and economic support for Russia since Putin's invasion of Ukraine has of course soured relations with the West. But Chinese officials have also tried to portray themselves as a neutral party and possible peacemaker to end the conflict in Ukraine. The threat of instability in Russia, though, this past weekend might accelerate China's efforts to resolve Russia's war in Ukraine. David Culver, CNN, Los Angeles.